Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat was buried in Ramallah this weekend. Tens of thousands of Palestinians gathered around his flag-draped coffin as it was carried across the compound. Mourners wept and chanted an emotional farewell bid to the only leader many of them had ever known. New Palestinian officials have been named to lead in the post-Arafat era, but the future remains uncertain. The new chair of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Mahmoud Abbas, escaped injury on Sunday after masked members of the Al-Aqsa Brigade opened fire on a gathering where Palestinians were mourning the death of Yasser Arafat. Two of Abbas's bodyguards were killed in the shooting. This past weekend, MIT linguistics professor Noam Chomsky spoke at the 25th anniversary of the Coalition for Peace Action in Princeton, New Jersey. Noam Chomsky has written over 100 books, a well-known political analyst, linguist at MIT. He talked about Yasser Arafat, about Iraq, about the military draft here in this country. He spoke on Sunday. This is an excerpt of what he had to say.
I had a little time on the airplane and read this morning's Times, and there is, as expected, a front-page story. Happens to be in the Weekend Review by a very good reporter, and it's about a highly significant topic, how to establish democracy, the president's messianic vision, as the Boston Globe calls it, my own newspaper. And it discusses a current example, which has had a huge amount of media commentary in the last couple of days, the Palestinian issue, what happens after Arafat. And the first paragraph says that the post-Arafat era will be the latest test of a quintessentially American article of faith, that elections provide legitimacy even to the frailest institutions. Okay, that's our quintessential article of faith. Then it goes on, and we'll skip to the last paragraph. The last paragraph on the continuation page says there's a paradox. In the past, the Bush administration, and he could have added every previous one, resisted new national elections among the Palestinians. The thought was that the elections would make Mr. Arafat look better and give him a fresher mandate and might help give credibility and authority to Hamas. Okay, so in other words, we have a quintessential commitment to democracy, but in the single example that is given, we oppose democracy because the outcome might come out the wrong way. Okay. Well, there are some conclusions you can draw from that one example. Yes, we support democracy as long as it comes out the right way. Otherwise, we'll block it. Now, more has to be said. The first paragraph is not false. If by Americans you mean American people, that's quite true. It is a quintessential article of faith among the general population that we ought to have democracy and elections. It simply is rejected by every single government and by the media and by elite opinion. Their position is we should have democracy and elections when it comes out the right way, as in this case. So there's really no contradiction if you sort of interpret it properly, but the lessons are there, and the single example chosen does, in fact, illustrate them. And incidentally, it's not unusual to find, and I often discover, probably others do too, that if you want to read an article in a major newspaper, the best way to do it is to start with the end. The last paragraph quite often has something interesting. The first paragraph usually has something for the headline writers and, for the casual reader. And I don't know if this is done consciously or not, but it's pretty consistent. Well, let's continue. What's illustrated by this front page article and a series of front page articles and editorials in the last few days is a principle. The principle is that we, and we is identified with the government, not the population. And as I'll come back to, there's a radical difference in opinion between them, but that we, the government, are always guided by benign intent. That's kind of like an axiom. We can make mistakes along the way, but the intention was benevolent. try to find an exception to that way at the left liberal end of criticism in the mainstream. Well, in conformity with these guidelines, the New York Times, the day before, had a front page think piece on Arafat's death. So did many other journals, but I'll keep to the Times. They're all approximately the same. The article begins by informing us, first paragraph again, that Arafat was both the symbol of the Palestinians' hope for a viable independent state and the prime obstacle to its realization. He was never, it goes on, he was never able to reach the heights of President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who won back the Sinai through a peace treaty with Israel in 1979 because he was able to reach out to Israelis and address their fears and hope with his visit to Jerusalem in 1977. That was the same story in every newspaper I looked at with slight nuances. There is a documentary record, rich, best possible sources, unambiguous, and it happens to tell a different story, but it's not allowed. And it's not allowed because it would violate the fundamental principle that what we do is benign. We, meaning the government, not the population. So let's take a look at that. The documentary record shows uncontroversially and explicitly and unambiguously that the main obstacle to the realization of a Palestinian state was Washington, and competing pretty well for second place is the New York Times and its colleagues, which have consistently suppressed or misrepresented the crucial facts. And the crucial facts are not in doubt. I'll just run through a small sample because it's brief, but let's pick some examples. So in 1976, the United States became the chief obstacle to a Palestinian state, very simply. Security Council of the United Nations debated a resolution calling for a two-state settlement, a Palestinian settlement, a Palestinian state alongside of Israel, both states having all the rights guaranteed in the international system. This was in accord with a very broad international consensus. It was supported by the Arab states, backed by the PLO, just about everybody. And in fact, that by then had crystallized as an overwhelming international consensus. The U.S. vetoed it. It was vetoed. A U.S. veto, incidentally, is a double veto. It vetoes the resolution, and it also vetoes reporting in history. So it's out of history. But it happened. Happened again in 1980, same resolution, same again. There's a long record up to the present, no time to run through it. It continues consistently, General Assembly, initiatives from Europe, initiatives from the PLO, initiatives from the Arab states, whatever they are, the U.S. blocks them. And that continues. The most recent dramatic case, there are plenty of others, was in Geneva in the year 2002. There a serious basis for settlement along the lines of the general international consensus was presented by prominent Israeli and Palestinian negotiators. It was strongly supported by almost the whole world, with the notable exception of the United States, which alone refused to send even a message of support, as was indeed reported in the New York Times in a very dismissive article saying this is all nonsense. Let's go to Sadat. Well, again, the facts are very clear. Sadat, in fact, did go to Jerusalem and make a proposal, but it was not. But that proposal in 1977 repeated one that he had made in 1971. In 1971, not 1977, Sadat offered a full peace treaty to Israel in accord with official U.S. government policy, offering nothing to the Palestinians. Their rights had not yet entered the international agenda. That was recognized by Israel to be a genuine peace offer. They rejected it. They preferred expansion to peace. This is the Labor government. Expansion then meant into the northeastern Sinai. Important question, as always, is what's the U.S. going to do? Under Kissinger's initiative, the U.S. decided to reject its official policy and to support Israeli rejectionism. The policy was what Kissinger calls stalemate in his memoirs. Stalemate, we preferred stalemate, no negotiations, just force. That led directly to the 1973 war, a very close call for Israel, nuclear alert, very close call for the world. After that, Kissinger recognized that you can't just dismiss Egypt as a basket case, began his famous shuttle diplomacy. That led to the Camp David agreements, where indeed in 1979, the United States and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer, okay? Actually, from the U.S.-Israeli point of view, a harsher offer, because by that time it included a call for a Palestinian state in accordance with the new emerging international consensus, which faced an impossible obstacle, namely the U.S. government and its media and commentary. Well, that goes down in history as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In real history, it's a diplomatic catastrophe. The U.S. refusal to accept a peaceful settlement in 1971 led to a terrible war, a very dangerous one, years of suffering and misery with effects that still are very much there. But it shows the advantages of owning history. You can kind of reshape it into your own, to satisfy your own needs, and you therefore get the first paragraph that I just read from the world's leading newspaper, front page think piece, duplicated just about everywhere in the media, and that includes journals of opinion. You might try to look for an exception. Well, the example does illustrate again the basic guidelines of commentary, media in particular, but commentary generally. We're good, meaning the government, not the people. We accept the totalitarian notion that we identify the people with the state. So when they say we, it means the government. The government is good. We are good, benevolent, well-intentioned. We seek peace and justice. We're foiled by villains who can't rise to our exalted level. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't even matter what simple logic tells us.
Noam Chomsky speaking on Sunday in Princeton, New Jersey. Afterwards, he was asked a series of questions. One of them was, would the draft be reinstated?
I think it's extremely unlikely. I should tell you, just as a word of personal background, I was very much involved in the resistance movement in the 1960s. In fact, I was just barely. The only reason I missed a long jail sentence was because the Tet Offensive came along and the trials were called off. So I was very much involved in resistance, but I was never against the draft. I disagreed with a lot of my friends and associates on that, for a very good reason, I think, at least. Nobody seems to agree. In my view, if there's going to be an army, I think it ought to be a citizens' army. Now, here I do agree with some people, the top brass. They don't want a citizens' army. They want a mercenary army, what we call a volunteer army. That is a mercenary army of the disadvantaged. And in fact, in the Vietnam War, the U.S. military realized they had made a very bad mistake. I mean, for the first time, I think, ever in the history of European imperialism, including us, they had used a citizens' army to fight a vicious, brutal colonial war. And civilians just can't do that kind of thing. For that, you need the French Foreign Legion, you know, the Gurkhas, something like that. Every predecessor has used mercenaries, often drawn from the country that they're attacking, like England ran India with Indian mercenaries. You take them from one place, you send them to kill people in the other place. That's the standard way to run imperial wars. They're just too brutal and violent and murderous. Civilians aren't going to be able to do it for very long. And what happened was the army started falling apart. You know, one of the reasons the army was withdrawn was because the top military wanted it out of there. They were afraid they weren't going to have an army anymore. You know, soldiers were fragging officers. The whole thing was falling apart. They were on drugs. You know, and that's why I don't think they're going to have a draft. And that's why I'm in favor of it. If there's going to be an army that's going to fight brutal colonial wars, and that's the only likely kind of war, I'm not talking about, you know, militarization of space and that kind of thing. I mean, ground wars. It ought to be a citizens' army so that the attitudes of the society are reflected in the military.